Well, friends, we have reached the end of Galatians. We've been journeying through this letter, and today we are winding up that series. A little preview of what's coming next. So next week we'll begin a series in the book of Judges, and we're just going to spend the summer doing some character studies of different people from the book of Judges, and we might expand that to a few other Old Testament characters as well. So please join us as we do that. But our text for this morning comes to us from Galatians 6, verses 1 through 5. I'm going to read this twice. The first time I'm going to read it from the NIV, and the second time I'm going to read it from the Message. So the first time, the words will be up on the screen. The second time, they will not, because I did not tell them that I was going to do this, because I didn't want to. But Galatians 6, 1 through 5 reads like this. Brothers and sisters, if someone is caught in a sin, you who live by the Spirit should restore that person gently. But watch yourselves, or you also may be tempted. Carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. If anyone thinks they are something when they are not, they deceive themselves. Each one should test their own actions. Then they can take pride in themselves alone, without comparing themselves to someone else. For each one should carry their own load. Now again, Galatians 6, verses 1 through 5. Live creatively, friends. If someone falls into sin, forgivingly restore him, saving your critical comments for yourself. You might be needing forgiveness before the day's out. Stoop down and reach out to those who are oppressed. Share their burdens and so complete Christ's law. If you think you are too good for that, you are badly deceived. Make a careful exploration of who you are and the work you have been given, and then sink yourself into that. Don't be impressed with yourself. Don't compare yourself with others. Each of you must take responsibility for doing the creative best you can with your own life. Please join me in prayer. Bless us this day, O Lord, with vision. May this place be a sacred place, a telling space where heaven and earth meet. Amen. So one of the things that jumped out at me about these 5 verses is an apparent contradiction, or what seemed like a contradiction to me in Paul's instructions, in these final instructions. He tells the church, the people at Galatia, 2 different things about burdens, right? Did you catch it? In verse 2, he gives one, and in verse 5, he gives another. He's winding up this beautiful letter where he has been pleading with the Galatians to not go back to become slaves of the law. And we've been talking the last couple weeks about freedom. And these verses give us a window into the individual and communal nature of following Jesus. Freedom is meaningless and destructive if it is not put into service of neighbor. Freedom is meaningless and destructive if it is not put into service of neighbor. So I want to talk about this freedom and what we are freed to. In particular, this morning, I want to talk about this apparent contradiction between verse 2 and verse 5. So in verse 2, Paul says, carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. And then in verse 5, he says, for each one should carry their own load. Perplexing, right? And that's this is one of those places where the language, the translation into English, we lose some richness and some clues that are present. So in verse 2, the word that Paul is using for burdens literally should be translated heavy burdens. And these are burdens that are more than a person should carry. Okay? So the burdens that Paul is talking about in verse 2 are oppressive burdens, you might say. They're burdens that are above and beyond what is normal or could be expected of someone to carry. And so, what might those burdens look like? Well, they would look like perhaps when we think about people who have experienced trauma, abuse, people who have experienced all kinds of hurt that are beyond the pale. So, for instance, someone who has experienced physical or sexual or emotional abuse as in their lives, that creates for them heavy burdens. These are not burdens that are normal to everyone. These are burdens that are deeper, heavier than normal burdens, right? Or you might want to think about this, and this is challenging for us, is that those who experience the evils of systemic racism are carrying heavy burdens. They're oppressive burdens. They're burdens that we're not supposed to carry, right? They're burdens that are wounding and too heavy to be expected to carry on your own. Those are oppressive burdens. And we could go on and list other places where where oppressive burdens are present. And I think when we think about it, if we think about oppressive burdens, it's kind of one of those places where you know it when you see it, right? And we also have to recognize, I think, that what might be a heavy burden for one person is not for another, right? The thing that you might experience as no big deal might have caused wounds for someone else that become oppressive, heavy burdens. And so we have to be aware of that. So these oppressive burdens are different than the burdens that Paul is talking about in verse 5. We'll come back to that in a little bit. Then if we move on to verse 4, you'll notice that in this short 5 verses, Paul, as he is wont to do, packs a lot in there. And there are some really challenging, we'll use challenging, words to us in these verses. After Paul admonishes us to carry each other's heavy burdens, and in that way to fulfill the law of Christ, Paul then kind of seems to take a little bit of a turn that it maybe doesn't quite make sense, but then when you start to think about it, it actually does. Because all of a sudden he says, if anyone thinks they are something when they are not, they deceive themselves. Or as Eugene Peterson translated it, if you think you are too good for that, you are badly deceived. What Paul is doing is he's pointing out our tendency to think, and he talks about this in another place in his letters. He says, do not think of yourselves more highly than you ought. Right? Because Paul recognizes that when we think of ourselves more highly than we ought, we will not, or we will be less likely to fulfill the law of Christ and carry our brothers and sisters' heavy burdens. because we'll think we're too good for it. Or here's where it shows up, I think, for some of us sometimes. When we think more highly of ourselves than we ought, we start to think that other people's heavy burdens are their fault. Yeah. It's tricky, sneaky, but it gets in there, right? It's like if we think more highly of ourselves than ought, we start to think that people who carry heavy burdens, that somehow they deserve those heavy burdens. Somehow they did something that means they should have those heavy burdens, and then so why would I help carry it? Or maybe we turn it into, well, they made those choices, and as my grandmother used to tell me, you made your bed, now lie in it. Right? And so because we think of ourselves more highly than we ought, as Peterson says, we refuse to stoop down and reach out to those who are oppressed. So Paul kind of weaves this warning in there that we should not think more highly of ourselves so that we can fulfill the law of Christ. Then he goes on to say that each one should test their own actions. Then they can take pride in themselves alone without comparing themselves to someone else. How many of you heard the famous quote by Theodore Roosevelt, "Comparison is the thief of joy"? How many of you know that to be true? How many of you did it stop from doing it? Right? I mean, this is a thing for us. In fact, I would argue that our whole economic system is built on comparison, at least in some sense. We have a phrase for it, right? Anybody want to guess what it is? Capitalism is the name of it. Keeping up with the Joneses, yeah. Oh, well, they have that. I need that. Now, I discovered or kind of realized I was doing this. Some of you know one of the things that I love to do is to cycle. I like to ride bikes like a little kid, and it's wonderful. But one of the things I very quickly discovered was that comparison can start to kill that joy. So when I started cycling, we were living in Sonoma County in Northern California, which happens to be one of probably, it's a premier destination for cycling around the world. People come from all over the world to cycle in Sonoma County. In fact, there used to be, I don't know if there still are, there used to be a couple of pro teams that did their winter training there. And that's pretty cool when you're out, and you see these guys and, you realize how fast they are, right? Until you start comparing. Because it's not just those pros that are good, there are all kinds of people who are really good, really fast. In fact, one of my favorite things about cycling would be sometimes I would be out on a solo ride, just kind of plodding along like I do, and I'd hear somebody coming up behind me, right? And I'd think, oh boy, I'm about to get past. And then this was my favorite, because the first time it happened, I almost fell over. This dude pulls up behind, I hear him behind me. He's behind me for a little while. All of a sudden, he pulls up next to me. I look over. This dude's got to be 75 years old. And, and so we do the thing that cyclists do. Hey, how far are you going? What are you, blah, 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 right? And he's like, yeah, see ya. And I'm like, wow, that's cool. And man, am I slow. There was also this loop that I used to do with a friend of mine. It was our regular training ride. It's called Sweetwater Springs Road. I've maybe talked about it before. It's got a really steep climb on it. And when I really started to get into cycling, I started using this thing called Strava. Some of you know what Strava is. It's an app where you can track your runs and your rides and different things, and you can have, it's like a social media for fitness people, right? But one of the dangers there is you start to compare. So like one day I got my personal best on this climb. And it was like, I don't know, 11 or 12 or 13 minutes from beginning to end. And I was stoked until I went to the leaderboard. And I looked and I saw that Levi Leipheimer, who's a former Tour of Spain stage winner, did it in 3.5 minutes. And all of a sudden my joy dissipated, right? Because comparison is the thief of joy. And when we compare, then we lose sight of the joy that we experience. And we start to think that we should be other than the way that God created us. And then maybe we start to think in ways that prevent us from doing what we're called to do, fulfilling the law of Christ, which is, of course, to love God and love neighbor. So back to our loads. So we already talked about the oppressively heavy loads that Paul spoke of in verse 2. But now in verse 5, Paul does this thing that's really confusing on first read because, at the beginning he said that we should carry each other's, and then at the end he says, for each one should carry their own load. And when I read that, I was really perplexed until I discovered that he was using different words. And so the word that he's using in verse 5 is actually probably a military term for a soldier's pack. And so basically what you might think of is this is this is the stuff we need for life. That's what's in our pack. That's what's in our load that we're supposed to carry on our own, right? It's the things that we need in order to do life, is the way I think of it. I thought of it as early in my career, fresh out of college, I was doing a youth internship at a church in Minnesota, and I'd been there about 2 weeks, and then the youth pastor who I was interning with came to me and said, I'm going on sabbatical, here's the schedule for the summer. That was my internship. Which that's a whole different story. But my first big thing was a trip to the Boundary Waters, which is northern Minnesota. It's one of the largest expanses of wilderness in the lower 48, right? Hundreds of thousands of acres of lakes and woods. And I'm taking a group of 5 high school boys at 22 years old into this wilderness. Now, we did have a guide, so, that was cool. I was very glad for that. But there was a rule when we were preparing for this trip, and it's called the Duluth Pack rules. Anybody know what a Duluth Pack is? A Duluth Pack is like this very big, it looks like a turtle shell made out of canvas backpack. So the Duluth Pack is bigger than a regular backpack, and it holds a lot. But basically, the Duluth Pack rule is you pack it, you carry it, right? So what's in your pack, you carry. If you bring it, it's yours. So if you decide you want to bring your personal library so you can have quiet reading time up in the middle of nowhere, that's your load to carry, right? And so that's the rule. And I think that's kind of what Paul is saying here. It's like when we take things for the journey or we have what we need, that's ours to carry. Another way of thinking about this, I think, and this I think is important in our context, is I think we could say that what Paul is saying is he's telling us, do the work. Do your work, because that's your pack to carry. So take care of yourselves. Do the work that you need to do to understand who you are, how life has been for you, all that kind of stuff. It should come as no surprise to any of you that I'm a big fan of therapy. I'm in therapy myself because I believe in doing the work. I need to understand myself and the things that I need to work through, and I need to work through them with someone who will tell me the truth in a safe space so that when I come out of that space and when I'm doing my life, I can carry my pack and reach out and help my brothers and sisters with their oppressive burdens. Right? So another way to hear what Paul is saying here is each one of you should do your own work. Now, I want to say this. It occurred to me as I was thinking about this week that here I am preaching this message on Father's Day. One of the things that I've become acutely aware of in middle age is this. Actually, there are two things. The first is, I remember a couple years ago being stunned by the number of suicides that I heard about of middle-aged men. Right? You're aware of this, right? That the rate of suicides for middle-aged men spikes, right? Because there's this thing that happens in middle age where you come face to face with your mortality, with the fact that maybe, perhaps, probably life didn't turn out the way you thought it would when you were 22. You know, you're not independently wealthy, retired, and, living in Bermuda or wherever. You're an average guy living an average life with all kinds of challenges and all the normal things that go with it, right? And so that becomes an oppressive burden if you don't do the work, right? The other piece that I've recognized throughout my life is that we men, we don't do a good job of connecting with each other. We're lonely, right? I mean, I've seen it in every church I've served. I see it out in the wider culture. We don't do a good job of connecting with each other and making space to build those relationships with one another. And I want to encourage you. I don't say these things to be like, oh, what a downer on Father's Day. What I'm trying to get you to hear is do the work. And part of that work can be joyful in that gather that community, right? Find your community of men and build it. But this requires intentionality. And this, we can expand this out to the wider church too, right? Because I've heard people all my life talk about how they're not experiencing community at church. But when you drill down a little bit, they don't attend anything other than worship, and when they're at worship, they bolt out the doors, right? They won't sign up for a small group, they won't attend this, they won't attend that, and then they say, but I don't have any friends. It's like, well, you have to put yourself out there. And I recognize it's hard, and it can be scary. But part of doing the work is putting ourselves out there so that we build the community, so that when those oppressive burdens show up, when those oppressive burdens get dropped on our shoulders, we have a community around us to bend down and to take our load. That's the beauty of the body of Christ. But in order to be that for one another, we have to do the work. We have to do our work. We have to do the work of building that community. We talk here at Kent Cove about pursuing joyful wholeness. That's part of it. It's part of experiencing that community together. Now, I've talked with some of our what I would call some of our foundational saints here, right? About kind of the heyday of Kent Covenant, when there was a big group of people who were connected and all this. And I said, so was this a program that the church put together? Oh, no. We did this ourselves. We called each other, we invited, we planned these, And what happened? Well, they built community, right? And so I just want to put that out there as a challenge to all of us, that in order for us to pursue joyful wholeness together and build community so that when we have an oppressive load, a heavy load dumped on us, we have a community around us to help us carry that load. That, friends, is a gift. So Paul is talking here about how we do that. And right before this, he's been talking about walking with the Spirit, right? So John Stott, the great New Testament scholar, wrote this about what it means to walk in the Spirit. He says, if we walked by the Spirit, we would love one another more. And if we loved one another more, we would bear one another's burdens. And if we bore one another's burdens, we would not shrink from seeking to restore a brother or sister who has fallen into sin. Further, if we obeyed this apostolic instruction as we should, much unkind gossip would be avoided, more serious backsliding prevented, and the good of the church advanced, and the name of Christ glorified. That's a whole lot. That's a big sentence. That all those things can happen if we're walking in the Spirit intentionally. We would love one another more, and if we loved one another more, we would bear one another burdens, and if we bore each other's burdens, we would not shrink from restoring somebody who's fallen away or stumbled. And if we obeyed those instructions, we would avoid, all of a sudden, unkind gossip would not be as appealing. It's an amazing thing. So basically what I'm urging you to this morning as we close out this letter is committing to both helping our brothers and sisters with their oppressive burdens and carrying our own packs and recognizing the difference. Right? See, this is one of the big challenges. Part of that work takes place in the mundane reality of life together in community. And so part of that work is recognizing when something that perhaps we have been trying to, pick ourselves up by our bootstraps or just not share with someone because it feels like it's our load to carry, that it's our pack to carry. Maybe if you have been butting your head against that wall for such a long time, that's not a burden you were meant to carry alone. But guess what? In order to share to have that burden shared, that burden has to be shared. You follow what I'm saying? So in other words, you can't just keep butting your head against the wall in a closet without telling anybody and expect that they're going to come and help you carry your heavy load. We have to talk to each other. We have to be vulnerable. We have to risk naming that thing that we're not able to carry. And in so doing, we give our brothers and sisters the opportunity to fulfill the law of Christ. And when a brother or sister shares that with us, we have the opportunity to fulfill the law of Christ. And it's a beautiful thing. And community is formed. But in order for that to happen, we have to communicate vulnerably with each other. And we have to be willing to name those places where the burdens are too heavy for us to carry. And I recognize that can be terrifying. But here's the thing. If we can learn to do this, we could be a powerful witness to the world. Because instead of seeing us as people who are like, sometimes I think the outside world looks at us and they see a school of piranhas. Right? Like, this is a group that will eat their own. Because they see us doing all this infighting and just like tearing each other to shreds. But what if instead of that, they saw us stooping down to carry our brothers and sisters' burdens so that we might fulfill the law of Christ? What if the church became known for being able to love each other well in the middle of difficult, hard, confusing circumstances? What a witness that would be. And that is what I believe Paul is calling us to. So may we be that church. Amen.